I did this wrong. Give me a second. Let's try it again. I don't need this now. I'm just get this out of the way. Get this out of the way. I don't need that either. Okay, there you go. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, just give it a minute or two, and then we'll start. We'll be reading Christmas Carol. But we'll just give it a couple minutes. Wait for more to show up. I would be playing Christmas music in the background, but I don't want to get like copyright claims and stuff, and don't want to deal with like YouTube constantly putting up ads because I don't have any like music installed on my computer. You know what I mean? I mean, nowadays people are just too lazy to do that normally, right? It's just like you just stream it off Spotify or YouTube to get your music, but anytime you do that, you have to deal with ads. And I don't want that to like interrupt while I read, so you just have to deal with a deafening silence and the sound of my voice. Alrighty, it's 3:05, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And we'll be reading this as we get ourselves more into that Christmassy spirit. You know, Christmas is like more or less 4 days away. Depending on how you want to count how much of Monday is already over. So then it'll be like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So 3 full days until Christmas, and then like half a day if you want to count the rest of today, right? So we're more or less like less than 4 days until Christmas. Can you believe that? Like, holy moly, like, Christmas has come fast. Oh, my cat is here because she wants more or less to suck my body heat. So she sits on my lap and finds it comfy and warm. Shh. Quiet, Missy. Anyways, so I know it's so weird to think that like Christmas is basically here. And I mean, if you've been out more often than I have, which is not that often, you know, you go to a store or whatever and you hear that Christmas music. No funny story, last week I was at a coffee shop because I was on my way home from going to the bank and whatever, and I stopped by a coffee shop, pick up a drink before I got home. I enter the store and it starts playing Winter Wonderland, and I was like, oh yeah, Because that's a thing, right? And I'm like, wow, can you believe that Christmas is so soon? And that was a week ago. So now we're only like less than 4 days. So yeah, Christmas is just right around the corner. And what way to celebrate Christmas and to read something, Christmas themed for today. That's why I want to read a classic. It's pretty short. So I should be able to just read this whole thing in one go. I'll spend the more or less 2.5 hours to the full 3 hour. I don't even think I need the full 3 hours to read this book. I will give a bit of a commentary on some, understanding old London. That's where the story takes place. If you don't know, I mean, it's one of those things where like, A Christmas Carol should be a story that everybody just knows, and I shouldn't have to explain much of the story in any context. But if you have questions about context of the story, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. But just throw questions in the chat, and I'll try my best to answer them. I mean, yes, people have actually like done a lot of like wrote essays on understanding A Christmas Carol. But otherwise, it's a pretty short story. It's only like 80 pages. So, like I said, it should be an easy read. And I mean, this is more, even though I put like the subtext and the category of the video as educational, it's more or less just, reading for fun. And I mean, A Christmas Carol is kind of meant to be read for fun. Although at the same time, you probably wonder, why would anyone read this book for fun? Like, it's actually kind of scary. So, but I think that's all the more reason to read it. And I mean, I guess someone with a dark sense of humor like yours truly would like something like A Christmas Carol, right? So, and I mean, of course, you can always just watch like all the different adaptations of A Christmas Carol, right? There's so many different movie adaptations, and I kind of will point out how different versions, at least the ones I'm most familiar with, play out certain scenes in the story. But I mean, one of the beauties of the simplicity of A Christmas Carol is that, you can take all kinds of artistic liberties with it. And some movie versions of A Christmas Carol have actually done really good jobs with that. So I definitely recommend you check them out. Anyway, that's enough chit chat about, enough of my preface, if you will. And now we're going to start reading A Christmas Carol. Whoops. Oh, I will show off some of the illustrations, because this book does have illustrations in it, which adds to the deception that this book is long, but it actually really isn't. So, here's a picture of these kids. They're waiting around the corner, and you can see Scrooge kind of walking by. So there's like two kids there, and there's Scrooge over here. Scrooge is the main character, by the way. He's, Mr. Bahumbug, hates Christmas, only cares about money. He's that kind of character, but, the whole point of the story is to see that, people like him can change. Alrighty. Let us begin with Stave 1. They just call it Stave because it's kind of treated like short stories from someone's perspective. Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. To start, a Christmas story with a ghost of somebody. But anyway, Marley was dead. That's the way to begin this story. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and of course the chief mourners. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change. For anything he chose to put his hand to, old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, that there's particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the contrary is done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that yes, Marley was as dead as a doornail. I mean, Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and Marley were partners, for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor and his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt about it that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from this story. I am going to relate if we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began. There would be nothing more remarkable in this taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, and there it stood years afterward above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he would answer to both names anyway. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, that Scrooge. A squeezing, retching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Sorry, I gotta just scroll down here for a second. There you go. Secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his weary chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitter than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have 'em. The heaviest rain and snow, and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Just move this a little bit closer so I don't have to talk as loudly. Or I'm going to tire my voice by the end of this. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of old Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year of Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breast and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole. I don't know why I said kinghole. And was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything. One might have thought that nature lived hard by, but was brewing on a large scale. The door to Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore, the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort... Okay, Missy. Shh, go sleep now. In which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first imitation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost. Oh, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, and his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle!" said the nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry?" What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. Come then, returned the nephew gaily. What right have you to be so dismal? What reason have you to be so morose? You're more than rich enough. Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, Bah! And followed it up with, Humbug! Don't be cross, uncle, said the nephew. What else can I be? When I live in such a world of fools as this. Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, said Scrooge indignantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should. Uncle, pleaded the nephew. Nephew, returned the uncle sternly, keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine. Keep it? Repeated Scrooge's nephew. But you don't keep it. Leave me alone, then, said Scrooge. Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. I dare say, I dare say, returned the nephew, Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. If anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as good a time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only one I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem, by one consent, to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them, as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on others' journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety. He poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him, yes. Indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in the extremity first. But why? Cried his nephew. Why? Why did you get married? Said Scrooge. Because I fell in love. Because you fell in love, growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. Good afternoon. Nay, uncle, But you never come to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas to you, Uncle. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word. Notwithstanding, he stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, as cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. There's another fellow, muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. My clerk with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, that's a weird word, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we would make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Oh, plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the Union's workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Why are they still in operation? They are, still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then? Both very, sir. Oh, but I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I am very glad to hear it, said Scrooge. Under the impression that they are scarcely furnished Christmas cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman. A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What should I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. Do you wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, That is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I cannot afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many cannot go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It is not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremendous vibrations afterwards, as if it were teeth chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blazing rapture. The water plug behind left in solitude, its overflowings sullenly congealed and turned into misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. And even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had been nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and tactfully admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" said Scrooge. "It's quite convenient, sir." "It is not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-crown for it, you'd think to yourself, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great cloak, went down a slide on Cornhill, at the end of the Lane of Boys, 20 times, in honor of its being Christmas Eve. And then he ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt, to play a blind man's bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner with him in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, or suite of rooms, I guess, is how you would pronounce that, in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be, that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run when it was a young house playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, however that would work, and have forgotten the way out. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it had been very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge has as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a very bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key on the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face? It was not an impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath of hot air. And though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible. But its horrors seemed to be, in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at the phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, that would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door. And he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh, pooh." Sorry, I should do Scrooge's voice for that. "Pooh, pooh." And closed it with a bang. That was a wimpy bang. Close it with a bang! There you go. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and 6 up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have gotten a horse up that staircase and taken it broadwise, with a splinter bar toward the wall, and the door towards the balustrades. That was a weird word. I had to stop there to read it for a second. The balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive going through on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lit the entry too well. So you may suppose it was pretty dark in Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button, for that darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that it was all right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, with standing on 3 legs, and a poker. Like a fireplace poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not like his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. Just kind of like a, gruel is kind of like a porridge, if you're wondering what that is. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it. Before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel, the fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles. I realize I have to start reading faster. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one of them. "Bah, humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in his chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanging noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging heavy chains over the cask in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling up like his pigtail, and his coat shirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, he could see 2 buttons on the coat behind. Scrooge had often heard that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. Nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through, he saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "Hey now," said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want from me?" "Much," Marley's voice, No doubt about it.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then?
Said Scrooge, raising his voice. You're particular for a shade. He was going to say, to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
Asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him.
I can. Do it then.
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if it were quite used to it. You don't believe me, observed the ghost.
I don't,
said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel it in his heart by any means. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his own terror. For the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play. Scrooge felt the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and shirts and tassels were still agitated by the hot vapor from the oven.
You see this toothpick?
Said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from him. I do.
You are not looking at it.
But I see it, notwithstanding.
Well, I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my creation. Humbug! I tell you, humbug!
At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain, a dismal and appalling noise, as Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, as if to warn to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face.
Mercy! Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?
Man of worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come for me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes no forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness that it cannot share
what might have shared on earth and turned to happiness.
You are fettered. Tell me why,
Scrooge said, trembling. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and of my free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Oh, would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy as long as this, 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable. But he could see nothing.
Jacob, old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands on his breeches pockets, pondering what the ghost had said. He did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting up off his knees.
You must have been very slow about it, Jacob.
Slow? The ghost replied.
7 years dead,
Mused Scrooge.
and traveling all the time.
The whole time. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. Here's a picture of Scrooge and Marley by the fireplace. You can see how Marley has like all the, like, he's like got all these chains and they have like little iron boxes and stuff. It's kind of to symbolize like his greed, basically. And that he's weighed down by his own greed.
You might have got over a quick quantity of ground in 7 years,
said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chains so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which is suscepted, it is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly is its little sphere. Whatever it may be, you will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Oh, such was I, that life's opportunities misuse. Oh, such was I.
but you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance and benevolence were all my business. He held up the chains at arm's length, as if it were to cause all of its unveiling grief, and flung it heavily on the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. Why did I walk through the crowds of fellow beings, with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge, quaking even more. Hear me, my time is nearly gone. How is it that I appear you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brows. There is no light, part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance of escaping my fate. Ebenezer Scrooge. You were always a good friend to me. Thank ye. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I have treaded. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over with, Jacob? Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, and the third the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. When the ghost had said these words, it took its wrapper from the table and bound it around its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth make when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chains wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no closer, and Scrooge stopped. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. None of them were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously as being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them was all clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. And whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, Scrooge couldn't tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became what it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, just as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge jumped straight into bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. I realize that I have to read this way faster now because I spent like almost an hour on like 30 pages. So we got to get a move on here. The first of three spirits. Stave 2. The first of three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes, when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong? An icicle might have gotten into the works. 12? He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12, and then stopped.
Why is it possible that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night? It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
Scrooge scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little of them. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and quite cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of his first exchange paid of Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth would have become a mere United States security if there was no day's account by. Sorry, I have to read a little faster. So Scrooge went to bed again, and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself after mature inquiry, it was all a dream. He flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced that he had sunk into a doze unconsciously, and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong!
"A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting.
Ding dong!
"Half past."
Ding dong!
"A quarter to it."
Ding dong!
"The hour itself?"
said Scrooge triumphantly. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now, with a deep, dull hollow, melancholy, 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but to those which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with an unearthly visitor who drew them. As close as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so much like a child, but like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, as white as with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, and the hands the same, as if its holds were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet most delicately formed, like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, with sheen which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which it was all visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which is now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part, and now in another, and what was light one instant, at another time, was dark. So the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctiveness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melt away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever.
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?
Asked Scrooge. I am. The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close behind him, it were at a distance.
Who are you?
Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Inquired Scrooge. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anyone why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. What? Exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out this worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through the whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? Scrooge disclaimed all intentions to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit in any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. Your welfare, said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive in the end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it immediately said, Your reclamation, then? Take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped his arm gently. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted for pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication.
I am a mortal, and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand. There, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mists vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven,
said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him.
I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected to 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lips are trembling, said the ghost, and what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way.
Remember it? I could walk it blindfolded.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go, then. So they walked along the road, and Scrooge, recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance with its bridge, its church and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting toward them with boys upon their backs, who called to the other boys in country gigs and carts, driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us. The school is not quite deserted, as they approached an old building, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one broken furnitures for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within. For entering the dreary hall and glancing through open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candle light, and not so much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made bare still by lights of plain deal forms and decks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire. and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Excuse me. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scruffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed water spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not even a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. You know, I can see it. There's no way I'm actually going to finish reading this in one stream. I thought I could read 80 pages pretty quickly, but it appears that's not the case. So I actually will kind of end it. I will kind of do more like story explanation stuff, and then like I'll go slower and read everything now, and I'll just actually do this in 2 streams. I guess it's not. I guess like me reading every detail is gonna like. It takes a long time, and I already see it's like 4:30. I'm already like halfway through the stream, and I'm not even halfway through the story. So maybe after Christmas Pass, we'll kind of call it, because the other 2 is, you know, take a fair amount of the story, and of course, they, you know, there's the ending as well, right? So just looking at how long this is. Yeah, so the ending's like 8 pages, but even then, that's still like 16 minutes, right? So sorry, I had to make that sidetrack because I'm changing the way we're doing this now. I'll read slower and then just split this up between 2 streams because I realize that, like, I don't know, to give you that Christmas Carol experience, I should read it properly and not skip stuff like I was doing earlier. I kind of want to have you guys, you know, have the experience of, you know, a Christmas Carol. Anyway, I'm going to go back to reading now. Where was I? Oh, yes. Sorry, I'm getting a little itchy with the hat, too. It's like kind of hot. Anyway, okay. Break's over. Just so I can find out where I was. Okay. The spirit touched Scrooge's arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle.
Why, it's Ali Baba, Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solidarity child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time just like that. Poor boy, and Valentine, said Scrooge. And his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?
To hear Scrooge expending all of the earnestness of his nature on such objects in a most extraordinary voice, between laughing and crying, to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city.
There's the parrot, cried Scrooge. Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like lettuce growing out of the top of his head. There he is, poor Robin Crusoe. When he came home again after sailing around the island. Oh, poor Robin Crusoe. Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?
The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday running for his life to the little creek. Hallo! Whoop! Hallo! Then with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self,
Oh, poor boy.
He cried again.
I wish,
Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff.
But it is too late now.
What's the matter? Asked the spirit.
Nothing,
Said Scrooge.
nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something. That's all.
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, and the windows cracked. Fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, and that he was alone again. When all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost and, with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. The door opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, addressing him as her dear, dear brother. Oh, that's supposed to be a voice line. I'm not doing a little girl's voice. It's gonna be way too hard on my throat. I've come to bring you home, dear brother, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. To bring you home, home, home. Home, home, little fam, returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That's home like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, and I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home too. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first we're all going to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world. You're quite a woman, little Fan, exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. And he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocity of condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister to the various old well of a shivering best parlor that was ever seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curious light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he would rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied to the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye, right and willingly, and getting into, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Here's a picture of younger Scrooge meeting with his sister Fan. And there's the schoolmaster, I assume, in the back. Oh, sorry, no, that's Scrooge, right? This is Scrooge, and this is the Ghost of Christmas Past. I thought that was the schoolmaster, but I guess he doesn't get depicted. It's just Scrooge and the ghost watching young Scrooge and Fan reunite, and how Scrooge used to have such a wonderful Christmas in the past, especially with his family. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost. But she had a large heart.
So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid.
She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children as well.
One child,
Scrooge returned. Ah, that's right, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered,
Yes.
Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lit up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it, said Scrooge. Was I apprenticed here?
So they went in, at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind a high desk. That he had been 2 inches taller, he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement,
Why, it's old Fezziwig. Oh, bless his heart, it's Fezziwig, alive again.
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock which pointed at the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice,
Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick.
Scrooge's former self, now grown, a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Dick Wilkins, to be sure,
said Scrooge to the ghost.
Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me. Oh, poor Dick.
Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig. With a sharp claw of his hands, before a man can say, Jack Robinson. Oh, you wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the streets with shutters. 1, 2, 3. Had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6. Barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9. And came back before you could have gotten to 12, panting like racehorses. Hilly-ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk, with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of fun here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer! Clear away? Oh, there was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was snug, it was warm, and it was dry. And bright a ballroom, as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came in a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it. And tuned like 50 stomach aches, in came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. Oof. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her younger brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected for not having board enough for his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door. She was one who proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, and some pushing, some pulling, and in they all came anyhow, in every who. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again. As soon as they got there, all top couples at least, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig clapped his hands to stop the dance, cried out, well done. And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there was no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had already been carried home, exhausted, on a shutter, and he were a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight, or perish. There were more dances, and there were more forfeits, more dances, and there was even cake, and there was negus. I'm not totally sure what that is. I think that's like a negus is like Actually, I'm not sure what negus is. I'm gonna go look it up. What is negus? Oops. Negus is a type of hot drink made of wine, often port, mixed with hot water, oranges, lemons, spices, and sugar. So that's what negus is, and apparently Scrooge at this party was having some. That makes sense. It's time to be merry, and you gotta have a nice warm drink. There was negus, and there was a great price of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled. And there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind you, the sort of man who knew his business better than you and I could have told him, struck up, Sir Roger of Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of wood. Nope, a stiff piece of work. That's an odd expression. A stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and plenty pair of partners. People who were not to be trifled with, and people who would dance, but had no notion of walking. So basically it means they were kind of getting a little drunk and just having a grand old time, everybody dancing on the dance floor. Think about it like a club, basically, is what's going on. I thought there'd be more illustrations in this book. That's why I thought I'd be able to get this in one stream. But doesn't look like that's going to happen. Okay. Continuing on. But if there had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not a high praise, you tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through all the dance, advance and retire. Hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy. Corkscrew, thread and needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. Guy knows how to keep partying is what that means. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During this whole time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything. He remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and becoming conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light on his head burned very clearly. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said,
Why? Why is it not? He had spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?
Oh, wait. I did the wrong voice. I'm supposed to be doing Dick's voice. I don't know what kind of voice to give him. Let's do that again, though. Oh, sorry, this is the spirit talking. It's not Dick. Okay, I don't have to do an extra voice then. Why is it not? You spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. 3 or 4, perhaps? Is that so much that he deserves your praise?
Isn't it that so?
Said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self.
It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune.
Scrooge felt the spirit's glance. He stopped. What's the matter? Asked the ghost.
Nothing particular,
Said Scrooge. Something, I think, the ghost insisted.
No,
Said Scrooge.
no, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. My time grows short, observed the spirit. Quick! This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again, Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice, which is another word for greed, by the way. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but he sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghosts of Christmas past. It matters little, she said softly. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. A golden one. This is the even-handed dealing of the world, the young Scrooge said. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much, she answered. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aberrations fall off, one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? He retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. She shook her head. I gotta check who's actually talking so I don't screw this up. Okay. Am I?
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by your patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy, he said impatiently.
Your own feelings tell you that you are not that you are,
She returned.
I am. That which promised happiness when we were in one heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly have I thought of this? I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you.
Have I ever sought release?
No, never. Not in words.
In what then?
In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great ends. In everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us,
Said the girl, looking mildly, but with steadiness upon him.
tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? Oh no!
He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition, in spite of himself. But he said with a struggle, You think not.
I would gladly think otherwise if I could. Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday,
She's got a lot of lines.
can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle. To do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were.
He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed.
You may. The memory of his past half makes me hope you will. You will have pain in this. A very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it. You will dismiss it gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened while that you were awoke. And you be happy in the life you've chosen.
She left, and they parted.
Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight in torturing me?
One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost.
No more, cried Scrooge. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more.
But the relentless ghost pinned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. There was another scene in place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same. Until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there. than Scrooge, in his agitated state of mind, could count. And unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, there were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like the 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter soon began to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What I would not have given to be one of them, though I never could have been so rude. Oh no, oh no. I wouldn't for the wealth of all the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. And for the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off. Oh, God bless my soul, to save my life. As to measuring her waist in sport, they did, bold young brood. I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never come straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of hair, an inch which would be a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet been man enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she was laughing face, and plundered dress was borne towards its center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and struggling, and the onslaught that was made on the defenseless porter. The scaling, him with chairs for ladders, to dive into his pockets, despoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him around the neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irresponsible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan in its mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey, glued to a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this a false alarm. The joy, gratitude, and ecstasy. They are all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. Now Scrooge looked more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard wind of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon."
Who was it?
"Guess."
How can I? Huh, I don't know.
She added in the same breath, laughing as she laughed,
Mr. Scrooge?
Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed by his office window, and as if it were not shut up, and he had a candle inside. I could scarcely help see. Oh, sorry. It's still the husband talking. I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death. I hear and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe.
Spirit,
Said Scrooge in a broken voice.
remove me from this place.
I told you, these were shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. That they are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me!
Scrooge exclaimed.
I cannot bear it!
He turned upon the ghost, and after seeing that it looked upon him with a face, in which in some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it.
Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no longer!
In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost with no visible resistance on its own was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning bright and high, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. Scrooge was conscious of being exhausted, and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being of his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which he had relaxed, and had bravely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. I'm just gonna take a look here, because that took me 2 hours just to read half of this book, and I don't want to spend another 2 hours reading the other half. And also I apologize for some of the awkward, janky reading. When I tried to speed it up, and then I realized I'm this is not gonna work very well. So, with that being said, I'm gonna start the reading here because we're let's say halfway through, right? So, just to sum up, what happened was Scrooge was met first by his old partner, Jacob Marley. And Marley warns him that Scrooge is going to meet three spirits that will haunt him, and hopefully Scrooge will learn to change his ways, or else basically be damned to wander the earth in chains, powerless to help anyone. As kind of this idea that the hell of a rich person is to kind of see all these people in need, try to help them, but be absolutely powerless to do so. That's kind of the idea that the story is painting, right? And so Scrooge actually sees this for a little bit. He sees some guys trying to help people, and they're powerless to do so because they're ghosts and all that, right? So Scrooge tries to sleep it off, and of course he meets the first of the three spirits, the ghost of Christmas past. And of course if you already know A Christmas Carol, you know who the other two are going to be, which we'll read their stories next week, or not next week, tomorrow actually. We're just going to actually end the reading here because I don't want to rush the story. I do like this story, so because of that, tomorrow we'll read the rest of A Christmas Carol, and I'll do the other two spirits justice, as well as the ending of the story. I won't speed read anything. I'll just read slower. I know it kind of seems impractical because the amount of time it took me to read this, you could watch an entire movie of A Christmas Carol. But I guess I can talk a little bit about it. like which ones I like and which ones I recommend to watch. The Disney Christmas Carol, it's like only like 30 minutes. It's pretty great. I've always had a special that version of it always a special place in my life because I don't know, it's just so charmingly done. You know, with Scrooge McDuck is Scrooge, obviously, and then Mickey Mouse is like Cratchit, which is the name of the the clerk. We actually in the book we're not actually told his name yet, but Cratchit is he's the employee, and it's funny because like Scrooge only has the one employee, so he can like pay as little as possible to his employee, right? He only has one, so that he doesn't have to pay very many people to maintain his shop, right? Because I mean, the whole thing about Scrooge is that he's super greedy, right? Like he can't even bother to have multiple employees because that's like an expense, right? He wants to have as much money as he possibly does. But the funny thing is that like, you know, in as I read through the story, and you know that there are certain parts where like Scrooge is contrasted to other characters that have like less money than him. But like there's this one scene in like the Jacob Marley chapter where we meet the mayor of the town. We just kind of introduce him as like the Lord Mayor. And this guy like obviously has money too. But it's implied that Scrooge has more money because he's been hoarding all this money for all these years. And you know, Scrooge like lives in a crappy little like apartment building, right? Because probably did not pay very much, which then makes you wonder what the hell is this guy gonna do with all this money, right? But I mean, there's obviously a lot of commentary in the world today, and I think it's also another reason why A Christmas Carol is such a good read, especially for this Christmas. And I, you know, don't want to get too political or anything like that, or too controversial. After all, we're just trying to have a feel-good story with A Christmas Carol. Of course, I mean, to be fair, A Christmas Carol is actually is actually kind of like a weird mix of like a Christmas story, and it's also kind of a Halloween story, because like to be haunted by three ghosts at Christmas sounds like absolutely asinine and horrible, right? But you know, it's one of those things where like people need to remember that Christmas is about being generous. It's about, you know, giving. And so, of course, like Scrooge needs to learn this, and he is obviously depicted as a very awful person because of how greedy he is, how greed will destroy men. And of course, that's one of the interesting things about when we read about Jacob Marley, right? Because Jacob Marley was probably just as greedy. And he's basically damned for eternity to walk around with those chains, right? And so, I mean, obviously that's not like the biblical way of looking at the afterlife would be, but I mean, that's besides the point. The point is that like, you know, if you don't repent, if you don't change, then you're going nose first into hell, right? And that is going to be awful no matter what version of it you think it is, right? Whether it's like the way Charles Dickens depicts hell, which I think is actually a pretty, even though it's not biblically accurate, I still like the way he depicts it. It's actually very clever. And of course it works well with the theme of the story, right? About how greed will destroy men. And you just see all these ghosts of like rich people of the past that try to help people, but they're powerless to do it. I mean, obviously Dickens, there, even though like the story takes place in London, there's a lot more like Catholic imagery, like this idea of, you know, you're in kind of this purgatory state and then moving from there to heaven. But of course, the idea is that you can never leave purgatory at the same time, because it's basically purgatory is another way of hell, but not the fiery pits that, you know, the Book of Revelation kind of describes it as, right? But instead, there's this cold contrast. Of course, it goes with the winter story too, right? This is once again, you know, like Charles Dickens doesn't have a biblical view of hell, but I think it works well for the story of talking about how, you know, the lives of greedy men, you know, if you don't repent from that, what's coming for you is pretty awful, right? And so that's an interesting theme in the story. And of course, the Ghost of Christmas Past does have a lot more content than the other two ghosts. So when I read, you know, tomorrow, I don't know why I keep saying next time, it's basically tomorrow. because I just want to get this, I just want to read this to you. But the next two ghosts don't have as much content, because of course, like when you're dealing with an old man's past, obviously he's got a lot of years of his past, so like it went over like 4 events. Him in school alone, him leaving that school because he graduates, and then his working his first job as an apprentice of some kind, and then of course his love life, right? And then there's the last part. Sorry, there's 5 things in the past, not 4. The 5th one is a showing what happened to the young girl, Belle. And Belle basically gets to live a happy life away from Scrooge. And her husband, which I guess I'll dub him Gaston. That was the kind of the voice I was going for. Gaston was basically like, hey, I saw that old Scrooge guy just like cooped him in his office. What a loser. Right? On Christmas Day. And so, Scrooge starts like, the ghost is always trying to show him that like, Scrooge kind of wasted his life. Right? That in the past he had been so caught up in himself. Right? Of course, one of the things that's problematic about the book version is that like the images that the Ghost of Christmas Past shows him, they're all kind of disjointed, right? And you notice that while I was reading it, not just because I was reading it fast, but there were some parts that are very disjointed, right? So there's like, but to be fair, like the Ghost of Christmas Past is showing him like certain spots in his life, right? So it's like he's in school, and then his sister comes and meets him, right? And then of course the sister is only brought up in the book because obviously we just have to have a little bit more exposition about the nephew, because the nephew is actually, he shows up again later in the story. He shows up, I think, in the Ghost of Christmas Present, because the nephew is kind of this contrast to Scrooge, and Scrooge realizes how terrible of a person he's being in the present, because in the present his nephew has his party, and at the party they just like gossip and make fun of Scrooge, and the nephew does nothing to protect him, because the nephew's like, well, why should I protect him? Why should I stand up for my uncle? Right? He basically thinks I'm garbage because I celebrate Christmas, right? Like, how funny, if you think about it out loud, that's kind of funny, right? Like, someone thinks you're an idiot for celebrating Christmas. And then if someone actually thought that, why would you want to why would you want to stand up for them, right? And so Scrooge will learn that, like, oh, I kind of, like, his past has caught up to him, that Scrooge has been pretty awful, and he is kind of supposed to see that he's facing that highway to hell. But of course he'll have more revelations, if you will, of how serious that actually is, not just in the life to come, but in his life now. And then what else do we have? We had Belle, right? And how it's I kind of don't like it in the book, where once again all the memories are kind of disjointed, because like the story never tells us how he meets Belle or anything like that, because the story is actually pretty short. I think there is actually a longer version, like a full version of the book, and it's like 300 pages. And that actually has like a lot more, because the Ghost of Christmas Past is like half of that book. But I didn't want to read that. That would take me like weeks to read for you guys. But basically, this is where the movies actually do a better job, I think, where Scrooge meets Belle in the movie versions, and he meets her during in the movie adaptations, whichever version, whether you're looking at the Disney version, the Muppets version, which I think I really like that one too, the one with Michael Caine as Scrooge, and then there's the Bill Murray one. In all those versions, they kind of cram the timeline, and they make Scrooge meet Belle during the Fezziwig's party, because Fezziwig is kind of like this kind of happy-go-lucky guy, right? And so in the movie versions, they make Scrooge meet Belle during Fezziwig's party, and then they dance together and all that, and it's actually a cute scene, especially in the Disney version, where like they're depicted with like a young Scrooge and a Daisy Duck, and It's like Scrooge is actually terrible at dancing. It's kind of funny, but then in the book it's just kind of like, oh, the scene just shows you the part when she leaves him, because this, sorry for my awful voice acting for women. I'm not good with women voices for obvious reasons. But, basically Belle points out that Scrooge has fallen in love with his money, right? As opposed to he cannot love people, right? And so, and there's the old saying, the love of money is the root of many evils. And so, I mean, that's why Scrooge's life is as terrible as it is, right? Because he grew to just love money. But anyway, and then of course, like, Scrooge is starting to see that, like, yeah, he did really mess up his past, and that's why it bothers him so much, and he doesn't want to see it anymore, and asks the ghost of Christmas past to, like, take him away. And so, we're gonna meet the next two ghosts, and then the end of the story tomorrow, because there's no way I can keep reading, and keep it concise. I want to do the story justice. I should have been more conscious of that. I should have planned it better, honestly. But I kind of just want to also read it for you guys for Christmas. And, I also encourage you to go watch, like, some of the movie versions, right? There's the one with, like, Bill Murray. It was done in, like, 1980, the late 1980s or something like that. That one had a really scary scene where well, of course, the Bill Murray one takes, like, a lot of liberties. Like, first of all, it's set in the modern day. It's not set in, like, old London. And then there's when Jacob Marley shows up, there's this weird scene where, like, Jacob Marley, he, like, tries to drink a Jack Daniels, and then, like, it just pours out of his body because he's an undead. So it's just, like, super weird. And then, of course, like, in the Disney version, Jacob Marley's depicted by Goofy. And there's this scene where, like, when Marley's about to leave, he trips down the stairs, even though he's a ghost. It's kind of, like, hilarious like that. And then the way I try to approach the story, I try to do a kind of Muppet style, where in the Muppets Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens is a character in the movie, and he's depicted with Grover, I think. Yeah, Grover is Charles Dickens. And so he's walking around and he's narrating the story, right? And of course he's got Rizzle the rat with him, and Rizzle just, like, asks his stupid questions through the whole thing, right? And Charles Dickens just goes on and he, like, narrates the story, right? And that one's probably my favorite, just because mainly nostalgia ties, honestly. But anyway, I'm rambling just to kind of fill up time, but I think 2.5 hours is long enough. And I'm only halfway through the book, so tomorrow I will read the other half of this book, and of course talk about, the story as a whole and the themes of Christmas in this story. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. I'll do the rest of it tomorrow, basically. And because of that, we're gonna do two, like, kind of hangout, I'll play whatever streams for, just kind of take this week easy. I won't do Throwback Thursday on Thursday. I think I'll kind of just, like, cheat Scum Brood War. I've already conceded I'll never beat it. And I'll just save that for New Year's Eve, actually, and I'll just kind of do a Throwback Thursday finale next Thursday. But for Christmas Eve, I'll kind of just do whatever. And same with Wednesday. Like, Wednesday, Thursday, I'll just kind of do whatever. We'll see what I actually do. But tomorrow, I will be reading the rest of this. And, I mean, I don't have to do a lot of gaming for, like, this week's streams, because, like, of course, I am doing the Let's Play on this channel of Fire Emblem 1. Definitely check that out. And yeah, that's all for housekeeping this week, and kind of what the plan for this week is going to be. So tomorrow, I'll read the second half of A Christmas Carol. And Wednesday, Thursday will just kind of be, like, hanging out. I'll probably play Mario 35, maybe play something else, if you guys want to watch me play something, depending what I have. And that will be for Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday I won't stream, obviously, because it'll be Christmas Day, and I will be busy, cooking up a storm and all that. Because, like, you know, in the morning, you got to start that roast in the morning, right? And, of course, you know, spending time with family on Christmas Day instead of, you know, doing this. So, that's kind of the plan for this week. And then, of course, next week, we'll figure out what to do from there. Because I'm going to try and finish up StarCraft Brood War. Of course, I mean, if I were to try and do it legit, but, I mean, honestly, I already conceded I suck at Brood War. So, I'll probably just, like, finish StarCraft in one more stream. And then, like, next week will also be pretty relaxed. So, if you guys have, like, requests of, like, you know, maybe you want to watch me play Mario 35 or something, you know, just let me know. And kind of be more relaxed for the next 2 weeks before New Year's. I do have a few ideas of what I want to do for January. But I will let you know more of that next week. Because I want to sort out some scheduling stuff with people. I still got to finish that Silent Hill with Taki, for example, right? And, I mean, we're way past Halloween. We're going to be past Christmas by the time I talk about it. So, yeah, it's weird how time moves fast like that, too. But, anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I've rambled on enough. I will see you guys tomorrow for the second half of A Christmas Carol. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. And God bless you.